Can we have a new cast system? Is an update not due?
We're downloading the new cast patch. We're just this is cast DLC that we're doing. And the concern is like, oh my god, we used to be white men at the top of the pyramid, and now all these multiply marginalized people invented the word intersectionality, and now they're the coolest, most awesome, like most listened to people on the block.
Which is really just a polite way of saying that they figured out that nobody ever gave a fuck about what a white man thought.
Hey everyone, welcome to Cracked Ivory, a podcast about the feminist discourses in academic theory and popular culture. I am Talia-bint-neyth, author of Trans Rad Fem, and your resident evil radical lesbian feminist.
I'm Emma Zakharuk, the author behind Dolphin Diaries, and your resident evil D-trans lesbian. And today we also have a guest. Kay, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kate Freeman, author of Shadows of Law, Intersectionality, and Police Development. I am mostly your local swamp hag, critical race theorist.
Amazing. We have a real good collection of like evil theorists threatening the West going on here.
Yes,
Fantastic.
which is exactly what the world needs right now, is more evil feminist theorists.
Yeah, I was completely serious about that.
No, I
So, today I have gathered you all for the purposes of talking about an extremely well-known word, specifically an extremely well-known word that indicates a theory that a lot of people also insist is well-known, but having heard people talk about it, I'm not so sure. I'm of course talking about intersectionality. You know, yay, intersectionality. We all love it. We all love intersectionality. The plucky little theory, the plucky little legal theory that around the turn of the '90s just swooped in and like saved all of feminism. Um, or so the tale goes, as theorized by Kimberlé Crenshaw. And it's a word that like became incredibly relevant about a decade ago. So like more recently than like people remember. But yeah, it's been quite embedded into the popular discourses for a good while now. Ultimately, really becoming popularized and like really hitting like mainstream cultural penetration around the times of like the feminist blogosphere, um, which obviously helped kick off a lovely little more conservative moral panic in response to it, as is usually the case with these things. But like, before we dive into it, before we dive into the actual theory and the way it has like interfaced with like popular feminist and other progressive discourses, I'd like to just ask each of you in turn, what you understand of intersectionality in brief, what you understand of like intersectionality, what like, the term means to you, or how familiar you are with it. Starting with Emma, the only white one on the episode here. So obviously, your thoughts are the most valuable here, Emma. Go ahead.
Thank you. I will start as the dumbest one here, not just because I'm white, but because I am. So I am like familiar with intersectionality mainly from sort of echoes of online discourse and online theory. So from my understanding of like theory, intersectionality is a explores the idea that when someone is multiply marginalized, it is not their experiences of life and the way they interface with the world and with the systems within it is not just that they are black and a woman, like, but that a black womanhood in and of itself creates a different kind of existence, and so on and so forth with disability, sexuality, ethnicity, race, etc. Within recent online discourse, anyway, I have mostly seen it applied, and again, discursively, not within academic spaces, as like kind of identity stacking poker kind of way. Like, I mean, to be clear, popular discourse is not exactly where you go for cutting feminist thought. I will admit that.
No. No, a lot of this podcast is going to be about like the distance between like what like a theorist actually says and like what like people think the theorist has said. But yeah, go on.
I have noticed that, from my understanding, intersectionality is specifically not about simply stacking different axes of marginalization as if it were a Jenga tower. But I have seen it mostly applied to.
Honestly, which is a shame, right? Because Kay, if that's what it was, like you and I we'd be running the show, right? We're like intersectionality. We'd be like ranked competitive. We'd be like varsity with this shit, you know?
Right, but to
Yeah.
wrap up my but to wrap up my response, basically, uh, what I have seen it mainly applied as is in various appeals to listen to someone other than who is talking. Most of the time, I have heard it, uh, to be frank, spoken by white people when people of color who are saying something they don't like are talking. So they are, in the process, bleached a little bit, and now different people of color should be listened to instead. that's that's my summary.
Look, yeah, we should be listening to people of color, but like ones who aren't in the room right now, you know. All right. Thank you for that, Emma. Kay, you now get to judge. No, I'm kidding. But like,
Judge?
does
Judge? No.
does what Emma said mostly dovetail with your understanding of intersectionality, or like what is your understanding slash relationship to this supposed legal theory?
Um, no, yeah. First of all, yes. I absolutely didn't disagree with anything that Emma said, except for one thing where you began talking about how maybe popular discourse isn't the place to go for feminist discourse. For me, I think that's also one of the points of intersectionality, one of the big points of intersectionality. There are always layers of language from like the official legal sort of, you know, official language, right, down to like local patois. And, intersectionality also demands that we start understanding people's world and their oppression in their own terms.
So I don't think we've begun the gush about the theory section quite yet, but just as a little
Okay.
preview. The generalizability of the theory, its intuitiveness,
Hmm.
is probably partly why it caught on with such fire. Like when like everyday feminists or even when like the common public was like exposed to it,
Uh-huh.
because to a certain degree it's an easy concept to wrap your mind around. Mm, kind of, because people do understand it in like crucial ways that or people do misunderstand it in crucial ways that we'll get into later. But on a very simple basic level, the idea that if you are marginalized on multiple axes, that if you face like a variety or a multiplicity of like systemic barriers, is such a like it's just something that makes so much sense and is so true that even like when Ben Shapiro was asked to like read the intersectionality paper and like actually critique what like Crenshaw had said, he just straight up was like, "Uh, no, that seems right." So, this brings us to 1989, finally. Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine. I'm not going to obviously be reading the whole paper out. It is 31 pages, and it is actually fairly accessible and free. It's available on a URL at like Chicago Unbound.
I think it's also available on her website, to be clear.
Yeah. It's available in a couple of places for free. So like, if you are someone who calls yourself an intersectional feminist and you are not familiar with the actual text of the paper, one, why? Two, fix that. The first line of the paper is one of the very few black women's studies books is entitled "All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave." And this is a really important line,
That's such a title.
right? Because what Crenshaw does in this paper is that she does in fact build a little narrative as well, and and she does it through the medium of case law, but it is very she makes it so it's actually very easy to follow her through all of these thought processes.
Yeah, and like that's itself, if I can really quickly, that itself is an innovation in legal scholarship and the way it's done, because typically, right, like the case stories right? Like don't matter in the courtroom, right? Like everybody understands like the sort of facts of the case, and like especially in appellate courtrooms and stuff like that, you're there to argue the like mechanics and finest like tuning of the teeth on the actual meat grinder, right? Like you rarely are talking about real people or anything else, and what are real situations. And what she does here is immerse you first and foremost in not just the facts of the case, but also the story itself, like what was going on, what these women were trying to accomplish, how they ended up in court, and like how the court fucked up.
Yeah, and that's the best part of it. All right. So okay. So we're gonna discuss three different cases. Okay. And these are like very important. So I'm gonna actually try to go through them in some detail without getting too bogged down. So the three cases are De Graffenried versus General Motors, Moore versus Hugh Helicopter, and Payne v. Travenol. Each of these cases are about like claims involving black female plaintiffs, and each of them sort of reveals or uncovers a different facet of how the prevailing legal doctrine actually thinks about. Okay, so she says it's about the claims brought by black women, but it's more what the court thinks about black women themselves as a class, about the harms they face, about their place in society, about how they move through society. In the first case, De Graffenried versus General Motors, it's about hiring. So prior to 1964, General Motors simply did not hire black women, and all of the black women hired after 1970 lost their jobs in a seniority-based layoff. Um, Obviously, that's bullshit, but the court provides some interesting logic to not take the claim seriously, let's just say. So I'm just going to read this out here. The court's own research has failed to disclose such a decision. The plaintiffs are clearly entitled to a remedy if they have been discriminated against. However, they should not be allowed to combine statutory remedies to create a new super remedy, which would give them relief beyond what the drafters of the relevant statutes intended. Thus, this lawsuit must be examined to see if it states a cause of action for race discrimination, sex discrimination, or alternatively either, but not a combination of both.
You can't see my face right now, but like my eyes are bulging out of their sockets because this is so fucking familiar. Like this reminds me, like not even any feminist discourse. Forget that. This reminds me of like people talking about like characters in a new Netflix show. It's like,
Oh my
do
god.
you mean there is a lesbian who is also black and with a broken leg? Like that's not real.
Okay, okay, I'm gonna pose a question to you right now. Okay, I'm gonna pose a question to you right now. To what degree does like legal scholarship resemble fandom discourse in your opinion?
How you gonna set me up like that? You said not to scream into the mic, and then the first thing you do is set me up for screaming into the mic. That's
Oh
Well,
no.
it's okay. It was not a serious question. It was not a serious question. Look,
like,
look, look. The most insane thing about that text to me, the most insane thing about that text to me, is the fact that the court just they bloody admit it, right? Like, oh yes, black women do face discrimination or can face discrimination on the basis of race, and they can face discrimination on the basis of sex. But they can't have both. Like, come on. What do you want to do? Are we gonna create a class of like super protected women? Are we gonna give black women more relief than anybody else? Are we gonna treat them? Are we gonna treat them special? Are we gonna give them special privileges? Imagine if there was a class of people with super special privileges in the United States of America.
sound familiar, anyone? All of my American trans friends out there. Does that sound familiar? Have we heard that before? Ever? I'm just asking.
The sheer audacity and the absurdity of it go just hand in hand, right? Because like they're letting you know, yeah, I fucking see it, but I don't give a shit.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out, because it is relevant with the way the court is currently working, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
the court has this history of being like, especially since I would say Rhinequest Forward, right? Of being very sort of cryptically conservative. And statements like this judge are being like, what, is there some super class, right? that we don't know about? Is that where these rights are going? That's usually cues to like conservative lawyers and the conservative legal movement, right? Like of how.
Okay, may I have permission to make an incredibly cringe joke?
Yes, please, God.
You see, Kakarot, you're not dealing with the average protected class anymore.
No, exactly, right? Exactly. Like the same thing happened here, right? That happened with Brett Kavanaugh's sort of philosophical musings, even though it's just a philosophical musing and it is not like an actual factual, like codified law, it carries the weight of law. And so the way this gets read in most conservative environments, back in the case of these cases, right, anti-union, anti-black, or anti-union, anti-civil rights, I should say, legal elements like the John Jay Society and the Edmund Burke Society. Anyway, right, like these are the things and cases that they latch onto, right, and
Hmm.
write future laws about. It's like, oh, okay, cool. So like, if this is going to be a discriminatory issue here, right, then here's how I can write these laws and frankly still discriminate, right, but do it in such a way that the court and the Constitution can't take note of it. And she's also calling that out here, which is wonderful.
It's really slimy in particular. Look, like there's a reason that I don't really hear lawyer jokes that much anymore. The public perception of lawyers has shifted somewhat, but there's a reason that like in the '90s we grew up with so much like lawyers are basically Satan jokes,
Yeah,
right?
this is a scholar like walking right up to the edge of fighting words in a lot of ways, right? Like, because she mocks the court a little bit here, like more than a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, no, because the court is so mockable, okay? Because
No,
like
yeah.
okay, let's go through the other arguments deployed in this case. Crenshaw will later call this, I believe, the sameness principle. How
Hmm.
like the sameness of black women as a protected class to other protected classes is actually used against them
Hmm.
to not pay heed to like actual unique harms to them, because like the court here straight up says that like, oh, yeah, sure, General Motors didn't hire black women before 1964, but they hired women, so how can we say that this is a case of sex discrimination? That's absurd. Bleh. And then they also go on to say that like, well, I mean, it could be race discrimination, I guess, but like, um, if you don't have like a race discrimination case that can be applied to like black male workers, then like, how can you say that like black women faced race discrimination in hiring? So throw that out as well. Just bleh. It's like, okay, so General Motors, if General Motors hired white women and if General Motors hired black men as workers, but they didn't hire any black women, they're not legally, they're doing neither sex discrimination nor race discrimination. And according to this sameness principle being deployed in the argument, the unique harms of black women are completely invisibilized, and oh, you don't have a claim here, throw it in the trash. And meanwhile, the entire time, black women are not being hired, and they're being like, fired in like seniority-based layoffs and such. Like, obviously, they are being discriminated against. They are very specifically being discriminated against. But
As black women. Yeah.
yeah, specifically as black women.
And again, like, absolutely, this is what I mean by read this thing. Like, it needs to be read in the same sort of voice that you would read a sternly worded, like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissent, right? Like, because that is, like, literally what she's doing. And she's also, again, right, like this argument about sameness, right? She's bringing up, right, like critical race law or legal studies and other traditions, right, where it's referred to as repetition. Like, so for critical legal studies, law only gains power through repetition. And the way it does that is it like lumps a whole bunch of things together that might not be the same, like lumping people, like a different groups of people into the same legal categories, but also, right, approaching every single solitary situation that is remotely similar through the same like pigeonholed set of laws over and over and over again, right? This is how like law really does for the critical legal studies really does come to take power, and how like Americans get that very smug like faith in like our legal system.
This really reminds me, the sameness thing reminds me of like the
Mm-hmm.
exclusion of trans women from progressive spaces that are like,
Mm,
well, we
mm-hmm.
have cis women, so
Oh.
we're not misogynist, and we have trans men, so we're not transphobic. So what is your argument here exactly? We
Yeah.
can't possibly be transphobic. Like, we're not transphobic and we're not misogynistic. What's the problem? There's no
Uh,
problem. There's no trans women, but there's no problem either.
That A, that did such psychic damage to me. B, Emma, I think you just made the best case for like trans misogyny theory as a fundamentally intersectional theory that I've ever heard.
yeah.
Well, the idiot savant strikes again.
No, it's not that at all, child. Like, and it's specifically, I'm glad that you bring up the current trans cases and current trans bathroom issues, right? Because this is exactly how the lower courts were treating the Gavin Grimm case, right? Like Gavin Grimm's case, background, Gavin Grimm was a trans boy in high school, or who petitioned basically the school to use the men's restroom, like saying that
Yeah,
he was not in fact third gender, that he was, a male and wanted to use the men's room, right? Rather than having to
yeah.
use the third gender bathroom, which was honestly also deeply inconvenient. It was like upstairs and away from like any of
Hmm.
his classrooms. So he literally had to like run, X number of
The
distance.
way the way like the way like the American legal system or like institution in general use fucking bathrooms to implement segregation time and time again, like bathrooms as the site of like
Well,
civil rights battles.
yeah, it's because it becomes like a sort of in run around like the actual court, right? Like when they start when the arguments when all of these arguments for gender segregation or sexual segregation itself are made in and around like the welfare and interest of children, they've turned us into a super monster, right? Like this is what's showing up in the court now with trans people, and it's what's showing up. It's what has already shown with the court, right? Like the Gavin Grimm principles are mostly writing at this point, and for the lower courts, which is what we're moving back to, right? The lower courts were basically like, look, this kid is not being discriminated against because there are restrooms for cis men, there are restrooms for cis women, and then there are restrooms for people who do not conform to either one of those genders, i.e., him. And so, like, the lower
Hmm.
courts couldn't see it as, right, like a discrimination against an actual trans person because they didn't understand, right, that for binary trans people, right, like being forced to go to a third gender bathroom is also pathologizing.
It's almost like third sexing and degendering is bad or
Bad.
something. Someone should write something about that. Um,
It's almost like they've been doing harm to children by doing these things, right? Like so strange.
mhm.
But moving on.
So that was Degraphenride, which that is sort of like the most in depth that I'll be going into the case laws. That was an example of like harms perpetuated against a multiply marginalized class based on the sameness principle, right?
Hmm.
Oh, we're not discriminating against the basis of sex, we're not discriminating against the basis of race, we're discriminating against you, but like, tough luck. Yeah. So the next two cases are actually what Crenshaw would later call the difference principle. They demonstrate the difference principle. So in De Graaf and Ride, the court used the logic that like black women are enough like white women that if General Motors isn't discriminated against white women, then you can't really say they're discriminating against black women either. And they're similar enough to black men. Yeah, same argument applies. But in these next two cases, which I will go over much more briefly and together, um, there's a difference principle over here where black women plaintiffs are not allowed to be the representatives of like a wider class. So one of these is a sex discrimination case and the other is a race discrimination case. And in either case, a black woman plaintiff was not allowed to be sort of the face of the suit because in these cases The court said that like black women were too different from white women, or they were too different from black men. There was something about them that set them apart from those other classes, and therefore black women plaintiffs could not be. I mean, it's true, but the fact that like it's being used to harm them and to erase their interests is absolute bullshit.
And it is one of the things that, again, right, like she's pointing to, is that like the court is having to go to some extremely ridiculous lengths in order to just like frankly not see.
Yeah, cause like, look, I'm gonna read out this like little bit of text from the case that she's highlighted. Moore had never claimed before the EEOC that she was discriminated against as a female, but only as a black female. This raised serious doubts as to Moore's ability to adequately represent white female employees, and that's just amazing.
Again, I can't help seeing parallels to transmisogyny. Like I know these are different things, but like it just echoes the pattern so much.
Look, like that's the point. This is the exact same sort of categorization with nonsensical categories that was used to stop racial, like interracial marriage, and was
Hmm.
used to keep, was used to promote like one drop of blood laws and things like that throughout the American South. And she kept, throughout the oral argument, she just kept hammering that point back home. Like every time it came back to her, she was genuinely just like, again, this is a sex-based classification on its face, the same way racial classifications, in mixed marriages were a ridiculous like thing. I mean, like people were going through family Bibles in the courthouse to see if there were any black members written down in the family Bible. Like that's how like crazy those laws and those categories got, right? And here we are again with the same sort of problem
Mm-hmm.
based in and around the same sort of devaluation of women's bodies. And let's be real, right? Like the bodies of black and brown women, BIPOC women, black and indigenous women, most specifically, right, are the ones that are first and foremost on the line, right? We disappear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like our two spirit cousins disappear with women at an alarming rate, right? For like no one to recognize them as being women. You know what I mean? For us to steal third gender and pathologize, right? Those like expressions rather than like, I don't know, look at the world around us.
Well, from practical experiences of living as a marginalized woman, I do see the pattern that people take in your marginalizations and they see them and they cherry pick the ones that will allow them to treat you the worst and discard all others as inconvenient.
And that's
No,
kind
yeah.
of what like Crenshaw's pointing out, like down to the whole like just look around, because she's using the language of legal scholarship to hammer home some incredibly common sense, like look how blatant this shit
Yeah,
is
right.
like the undercurrent of this entire section, because it is obviously bullshit, because it's a double bind. Black women have been like, so if black women are specifically discriminated against as just black women, then like the company isn't doing enough discrimination, so so the specific harms to black women cannot possibly matter and cannot be taken into account. But also, if black women face specifically sex discrimination, then the court is like, well, you're a black female, and it's like, I mean, you can't represent all the other members of your sex category, and you can't represent all the other members of your race category. So they're both too similar and too different to actually be properly taken into consideration, which there's absolutely no consistency here. The only logic here is that how do we harm black women as much as possible?
Hmm.
Like that is the only principle you can come away with after you like go through these three cases that like Crenshaw has chosen to like highlight highlight these massive, I don't know, maybe not intentional necessarily, but these massive gaps in anti-discrimination law that are like weaponized to like deny black women any relief. Sometimes with the justification that like, oh, if we allowed black women to do this, they would have too much relief.
No, yeah, exactly. That is the exact point of the conservative legal movement in the United States right now, right? Like that is exactly what they're doing. They are, you know, most of the things that we are discussing right now in a lot of ways would be considered settled law in the sense that if trans people can prove, right, that they are being specifically targeted as a class, then certain like certain civil rights like legal machinations just go into effect, like scrutiny, like asking like how deeply they are going to scrutinize the state's action to begin with. Right now in Scrimeti, they're saying that bans on children's medical treatment simply needs to pass the smell test. Mainly that like the government just needs to have a good reason to do this. One of the most powerful ways that civil rights law was hemmed off as it was really getting started, right, is through that by continually just moving the goalpost around, right, about what constitutes, right, a suspect class, what constitutes a legal class, even. And that's exactly what we saw with gay marriage, women's pay equity, right? Like the women's pay equity movement was largely led by right? Like black workers who were making this very argument of discrimination and essentially saying, yeah, right? Like you hire black women workers, right? And but you only hire them for shop floor position. None of us are in management, right? Some of us are in secretarial, right? And those of us that are in secretarial, we're never going to be advanced in any way. There's never going to be any sort of advancement because we can, like, we are literally sitting at the edge of the glass ceiling, right? Like, it's, you know, like, it's the same, like, you are discriminating against us because, like, of the fact that we are both black and female because, like, this is how those intersections line up.
Yeah, and so much of this just seems to be such like a painful exercise at like pulling teeth and getting like the courts to admit that this is what they're doing. Like, come on, we see the shit for what it is, and we see how weaselly it is.
I think it's also because ironically, America sort of likes to see itself as a like Lockean liberal democracy. You know what I mean? Or a Lockean liberal
Right.
republic, when in reality it's a Hobbesian commonwealth. And so, like, our constitution, our law, like law itself, is literally the living God in a certain sense, right? Like judges see themselves as protecting the sanctity of this thing, right? Over and against, right? Like this is a problem with sameness and
This
repetition again,
this
right?
eldritch beast that we divine and appease, but whose intents we can never truly know.
Right? And like what ends up opening is just the right amount of space for, in the case of Kimberlé Crenshaw, black women to just be sifted right through the law without ever having any sort of honest redress of their grievances, right? Just sifted right out of the law, grievances ignored, just as a matter of like, well, you didn't win your case. This is an adversarial legal system. I don't know. We could probably do a whole episode on like the problems with the American legal system and why, Kimberly Crenshaw's projects have been so damning to that system and also important for us, right? Like, and I'm also thinking here of, the African American Policy Forum that she started or that she co-founded and the Say Her Name movement, right? Before Crenshaw like really started hammering home the fact that it was in fact black women who were a lion's share of right police killings and the preponderance of uninvestigated like murders. Nobody was even mentioning, right? We literally all out in the streets chanting "Say his name." and we could tell you every single solitary brother's name, and we knew Sandra Bland's name. She keeps a roving list of police violence against women, against Black women, against BIPOC women at this point. It's important. It's necessary. It's what the MMIW movement has been screaming since the founding of the first reservation and, the laws governing the American laws governing like sovereign reservations, sovereign Indian nations.
And you gotta scream, right? Because you absolutely have to scream because so much of this is just like a refusal to listen. It's blatantly happening in front of you.
Yeah.
Everyone understands the rules intuitively. They understand it because they need to understand the rules to know how to deploy them to hurt you. But
hmm
when you try to talk about it, when you try to name it, when you try to get them to admit what they're doing, suddenly.
No, like I think this is honestly the most powerful parts of the legal narrative, right? And she is displaying them so well that, you know, where legal narratives, where counter narratives actually come into this, right, is like without the information and the story and the narrative of, the context of these cases, right? As a general tendency, law students, political science students, policy students would not read or take into consideration, right, oral arguments, the reasoning of justices as they put it down and things like that. They are literally going to read these cases and pull the legal text out of them and argue to the legal text going forward, right? In other words, they're going to sanitize this entire narrative, right? And make it about points of
Yeah.
law and nothing else. And what she keeps going back to in the stories of each one of these cases, right, is how patently ridiculous the process of sanitizing these cases is, and also how counterproductive to like legal practice as we understand, as Americans understand it, right? In this deified sense, it really is, right? Like it's kind of like she's pointing out the flaws in Ptolemy, right? She's like, the only way you get to the, an American centric legal universe, right, is if you're spending all of your time with these ellipses inside ellipses and all this other bullshit that doesn't make any sense. When in fact, if we just recognize that we are not, that white men are not the center of the American legal universe and not the preponderance of people with legal claims anymore, we can begin to like develop law into something that's a lot more like useful and a lot less, in the American case, a lot less rigid and a lot less like cold and calculating.
So I'm so glad you said that, and I'm so glad you said that in specifically that way, because now we're gonna go away from the actual text of the paper. Again, it's a short paper, you know. If you're listening to this and you're interested in actually and if you're interested in intersectionality and intersectional feminism, read the paper, read the bloody paper. But we're gonna step away from it for a moment because we're gonna talk about about like the motives of people who call intersectionality a legal theory, quote unquote, in a very particular way. All right. So we're gonna travel now all the way to 2019. Okay, where like intersectionality is now well known as a feminist theory, as an anti-racist theory. It's now part of the discourse, right? And inevitably, as with like all progressive philosophies or even just feminist theories that become part of the discourse, there is a conservative backlash.
Mm, an immediate conservative backlash, right?
Exactly.
Not to spoil anything, but for the purposes of this podcast, I am subjecting myself to Abigail Schreier's seminal work. And you might be surprised, but intersectionality shows up, like the word, in the preface.
Yeah, because like it was intersectionality before it was critical race theory, right? And like I think it was critical race theory alongside it being woke. There's always a scare term. And we should be looking at this as exactly what it is, which is like an attempt at like epistemic vandalism, at epistemic violence, epistemic injustice, in fact. Because what a lot of conservatives do, if you are noticing the pattern, if you're noticing the patterns of behavior, and if you're like looking at the mindsets of these conservatives quote intellectual unquote, then what they do is that they see language, they see progressive language that is threatening, and then they try to recuperate it, defang it, render it meaningless, associate it with things that it's not fundamentally about. And I'm sorry to say that due to the high levels of like illiterate people who can read, they can read, but they're still illiterate in the United States, this tends to work.
Yeah, I want to step in this moment and like defend like the people of America. I do. All of the American listeners know why I'm not. Okay. Did that just land?
Yeah, I love UK.
No, and
All
yeah,
right, all right.
like I think as we move along, I just want to pin something that you said that is extremely important, right? The process by which conservative legal movements, especially in the United States, have defamed this, redefined it, and then redeployed it as this other thing, right? Of, like they're teaching your children that white people are bad. No, 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 no. They're teaching your children the very reality that this is a settler colonial nation, and that
Mm-hmm.
came with a lot of costs to very specific groups of people and a lot of benefits to other people. And that needs to be talked about. And it especially needs to be talked about with children. I know that that's going to upset a lot of white parents. I know you're scared right now. Listen to me. Here's why. It's because if your children are not given the tools to understand this racial hierarchy that they are trapped in, they are also not going to get the tools to understand why most indigenous African immigrant people in the United States
Mm-hmm.
are so angry. And they're always only going to read that as hatred of white people instead of beginning the real work of tearing those things down and having reconciliation conversations around it.
And that's the fucking point, though, right? Because what the conservative epistemic agenda wants, that is exactly what they want. They want this to be. They want to obscure the power relations. They want to
Oh, yeah.
obscure the historical reality. And they wanted to be like, oh, this is just personal acrimony, like you're a white person, you suffer, and here comes along this like person of a different race, and they're like, I'm more oppressed than you, give me special treatment. This is the image that the conservative wants when it comes to race discourses in the minds of white Americans, because like, okay, we have a friend of the pod, May Peterson, a woman who I love dearly and who I
Hi,
talk to
May.
about these topics at length. Hi, May. And I say epistemic way too much. I use that word way too much at this point because it's become my singular focus. The way that like the systems of like knowledge and ideological productions are literally weaponized to deny marginalized people's voices. But May has like such a better term for it, which is just unburial. Like what we're trying to do as activists, what we're fundamentally trying to do as like writers and activists and theorists is that we are attempting an unburial of all these things that the reactionary conservative agenda is trying to just like shove under the rug. We are trying to make them explicit. We are trying to make them known. We are trying to name them. We are trying to, bring them out into the open. And like Kimberlé Crenshaw did this in an incredibly brilliant and amazing way. And so many people, conservatives, yes, but not just conservatives, so many people have never forgiven her for it.
Yeah, so for the benefit of the listeners, just to explicate on what on what like the conservative backlash is basically like in case you're not familiar, blissfully, the backlash to intersectionality is essentially painting it as a hierarchy competition in which like the uppity those uppity people appearing out of nowhere are placing themselves on top of you because they're victimized, and that victimization now suddenly, all of a sudden, grants them more protection, more voice, more space.
My favorite is reverse racism or reverse hierarchy.
That's like amazing because this article doesn't even use that term. This article uses the term, I shit you not, and like this jump scared me when I saw it right at the beginning. The new caste system. And I'm just like, okay. They just come out and use the term new caste system because Isabel Wilkerson put out a whole book on it, and here they just fucking admit, oh right, we had an old caste system in America. I guess Isabel Wilkerson shouldn't have bothered with the book. We'll just admit it now.
Look, can we have a new caste system? All the caste systems are like eons old. Is an update not due? Like nothing has changed in a billion
We're
years.
downloading the new cast patch. We're just this is cast DLC that we're doing. And like the concern is like, oh my god, okay, we used to be white men at the top of the pyramid, and now all these multiply marginalized people invented the word intersectionality, and now they're the coolest, most awesome, like most listened to people on the block.
Which is really just a polite way of saying that they figured out that nobody ever gave a fuck about what a white man thought. Um,
Right?
unless that white man was holding a gun.
This is one of those things where like you really need to look at the material realities of the situation because marginalized people being granted a modicum of social cachet by any sort of progressive movement like feminism, like intersectional feminism, etc., pales in comparison to all the grinding, rusted inertia of the social system that push them down. And like, yeah, sure, now there are more marginalized people speaking up for themselves publicly. That's true, but like, look at the numbers. Look at how many marginalized people are in academia. Look at how much money they're making. Compare that to the money that everyone else is making. The caste system hasn't been threatened for shit.
No.
Okay, Emma, look. I know you said we should look at the material reality, but what you fail to understand is that Ben Shapiro has an opinion. Uh,
And he can afford to enforce that opinion on us. Like,
yeah.
it is literally the name of the game, right? And the number of, like, when we do, like, critical race theory and when we do begin talking about intersectionality and overlapping oppression, man, man, I read a lot of papers about Ben Shapiro. You know what I'm saying? Because
Oh
like
my god.
he he
Oh, that
he
sounds painful.
presents as a conservative that has already read this material and is in fact just anthologizing it for other concerned viewers, when in reality, like, I mean, sure, he said he didn't have any problems when he actually read it. I would maintain that he didn't read it then either. He just also couldn't answer any questions about it because he didn't read it.
This podcast is issuing an open challenge to Ben Shapiro. Please prove that you have read the intersectionality paper. You cannot listen to the first half of this podcast.
I'm gonna go a little deeper because I'm a hood rat. Hey Ben, listen to me, dog. Listen. Anywhere in the world, anytime, you and I will find ourselves in a nice building with a covered parking lot. We will sit down, we will publicly debate. And if you don't like what the fuck I got to say, we can step right over into that covered parking lot and we can finish it street style. It would be my absolute pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much. Because I'm about to say something that might make you hate me. What if I told you that in that Vox article where Ben Shapiro pretends to have read the intersectionality paper and then like effectively dismisses Crenshaw's paper as just legal scholarship, confining it to the realm of the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that's the tactic he's using. He's like, oh yes, as a piece of technical legal writing, I'm sure it's fine. But the way everyone has interpreted, the way everyone has interpreted to set up this new caste system where white men are at the bottom, So effectively, what he's saying is that Crenshaw's scholarship is fine as legal scholarship, but the popular perception of it is the problem.
Hmm.
What if I told you he had a fucking point?
No, I agree with that 100%, right? And like, here's the thing,
Ah,
you know, a broke ass clock is right twice a day. It's gonna be 2:30 in the morning, 2:30 in the afternoon. You're gonna get two good uses out of it. Ben Shapiro just hit one. And he, let's be frank, hit the most basic nail in the entire building on the
yeah.
head, right? Like the one that you're like, oh, that nail is not all the way in. Let me go take care of that, right? And that's actually all I want to say about that because I do like want to get into, right, like the politics of how she is used, not just by the right, not just by Ben Shapiro, right, but like even in the masculine studies articles that we used, like, or that we read for the background for this, right? Like this,
We're getting there. We're
like,
getting there. Cause that's the thing, okay? Cause like, we're like it's easy to make fun of conservatives, right? You know, they don't share our political project. They are directly opposed to us. No one here is a fan of conservatives, but but it's not like the liberals. It's not like the liberals and the progressives are much better on the topic of intersectionality, and that's a fucking problem.
It
Go ahead,
is,
Emma.
and the thing about um, a lot of right wing stuff, the right wing is really good at rhetorical stuff, and it's really good at pushing its agenda. And it's very easy to laugh at them when you don't share their agenda, and like because it's very easy to poke holes in their reasoning and stuff like that, and point out how it's ridiculous. But they don't actually care about logic. That's the thing. But their grievances come from some legitimate feeling, not necessarily a true one, but it comes from a real place of feeling. How deranged it is depends, but you know, and they often spot real tendencies. They're just like glopped, slathered, and cushioned in a lot of conservative rhetoric. But like it's the same with like Ben Shapiro noticing that the interpretation of Crenshaw's theory is wrong and like spotting the Jenga tower.
well, of course he spotted it. He's on the bottom of it for the first time in his life. Like this is the first time that
Right, I
he's
know,
openly
right?
bottoming anything, and he's uncomfortable and he's afraid.
Mhm. He's not used to this feeling.
No,
Yeah,
it's
you
a very
know.
uncomfortable feeling for him. But the first cracks in our eggs are almost that way. Almost always that way. See you soon, Ben. See you soon, baby.
Uh,
You're doing great, girl. You out there just being a problem, like tearing the whole world down, like while you like work on your gender. I see you, boo.
I was about to say I have no idea if this is going to make it into the final episode, but yes, it absolutely is.
It
Anyway.
is. It is. If the audio is audible, it is.
That petty little twerp is gonna listen to it. He listens to all this shit just so he has like fodder for his fucking like cult. And since we're saying all of this on the record, Ben, I want you to know right now, cuz pull up, motherfucker. Pull the fuck up. Anytime you're ready, like just pull up, dog. We'll see you
Well,
soon, okay?
honestly, Ben Shapiro is not the only person who needs to pull up right now, though, because like, okay,
Oh man, there's
we
a
we
fucking list.
we there's a list, yeah, because like, look, intersectionality is a groundbreaking theory, and like, but like, conservative people are not the only person attempting to do epistemic burial here. Okay,
Mm.
it's like very clear and like very evident, and like it's so blatant. All right, so I'm gonna no citations, okay? I'm gonna freestyle for a bit. This isn't the preface of my book. I don't know. I don't know if I have like spoken about it on another episode, like, because like this is an observation that I have made simply existing as a brown trans woman who talks about feminism online and who often gets responses from people who are marginalized on fewer axes of oppression than I am, but who still seem convinced that I have never read intersectionality and insist that I have to read intersectionality, and that if I was familiar with the text of intersectionality, a text with which I'm so familiar I barely needed to refer to the paper in the beginning of this episode in order to talk about it. Um, but people insist that if I was familiar with intersectionality, then I wouldn't be saying all these outlandish things like men benefit from patriarchy, or that like misogyny hurts women, or like all these like weird, far out there ideas that like the oppression of women is like fairly transcultural and a bad thing. This is just something I have observed by like interacting with like not necessarily like theorists and like peers in that regard, but just like people, right? Who have these popular ideas of intersectionality, who have like gotten their feminism and their anti-racism from like online blogs and Vox articles and such, right? And the
And
idea that
sometimes
they
Tumblr.
have of yeah, or well, I wasn't going to say it, but and the idea that they have of intersectionality is that actually intersectionality is a word. It is a magic spell that I say to get someone who is like saying things I don't like to shut the fuck up. I say intersectionality, I cast intersectionality, and now suddenly the other person has to think about five perspectives that they didn't account for. And like have to like like take accountability for not acknowledging in a too general statement or something. And this almost always comes up in discussions of male supremacy, of patriarchy, of feminism, as though intersectionality is something apart from feminism. And well, we'll get to that in a second. Kay, Emma, have either of you ever had experiences like this? Well, Emma has. She talked about it in the beginning of the episode. So, Kay, have you ever had experiences like this?
No, of course, right? Like, of course,
Oh,
like this
oh, girl. I love your poker face. Go on.
this is right. This is like the experience of the academy. No citations. I'm just gonna freestyle for just a second as well, right? Like this is specifically what we talk about when we talk about like toxic masculinity and toxic whiteness in the academy, right? Like the two like men's studies articles that we read here, and I would also like link critical whiteness studies because they share
Mm-hmm.
so much in common, right? It's not even that they're pointing out something that, you know, critical race theory wasn't intended to point out or wasn't already saying, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Crenshaw herself has pointed out that like even whiteness is a set of intersections. Even white masculinity
Mm-hmm.
is a set of intersections in all its own, right? And so, like, on the one hand, sure, right? Like, as a scholar, I think it's important that all scholarly avenues are explored, that they are discussed and, like, researched, thoroughly researched. But neither one of these articles really point out anything new about intersectionality as a theory. Both of them, my beef with them is that intersectionality in their article, their use of it, right, in both cases, is this very brief paragraph describing,
Mm-hmm.
describing intersections, citing Crenshaw, and then quickly moving to both prove and then categorize, right, the intersections of white masculinity. And yeah, but like, sure, right, but like, we don't need that.
but is that the most relevant application?
No, yeah, exactly, right. Like
Did anyone
literally what
ask
you just told
themselves?
me is that the canon of Western liberal thought is made up by different people. You know what I mean? It's like this is not scholarly, this isn't a scholarly revelation. None of that. We have ample, ample historical record of the four archetypes of male. What was it? Hegemonic male. Yeah, this like, and then basically this one puts masculinity on a spectrum between hegemonic masculinity, which is upholding the current male dominated state of affairs, literally state of affairs, right? And what they refer to is like low key failed manhood, right? Like people who don't fit into that masculine like culture in any way, shape, or form, right? And
Interesting.
they start pulling all of these nutty examples because they're doing this on football, right? So like there's this
Fucking
whole useless
football.
discussion
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how
Okay, okay.
fucking hot David
The,
Beckham is. Yes, David Beckham was hot. And one of the things that made David Beckham such a hot man was his androgyny.
sure,
You
he's
know,
European. Fine.
yeah, right. Like you have to understand that like anything left of like the actual factual Davy fucking Crockett dying at the Alamo, right, is is considered androgynous for masculinity where we're from, right? And so, him presenting a softer side of masculinity is coded as, right, in this article as like a sort of failed masculinities that didn't projects of masculinity that didn't really take on, but like he was just a European guy.
Look, I did not think my opinion of the Academy could get lower. I did not. I felt like I had bottomed out,
Listen,
but like as
no, there is no floor.
yeah, there really isn't, because Kay just made me confront the fact that like an academic paper that like uses the intersectionality framework and tries to talk about failed masculinity decide to do so. And like, you know what's the best realm to talk about failed masculinity? Fucking football. And who's you know who's a great example of failed masculinity? David Beckham. The three transsexuals on this podcast are all like totally in agreement. Yes, David Beckham is the best example of failed masculinity that you can think of.
I mean, as far as a puff philosophy piece goes, and yes, it was a puff theory piece, right? Like David Beckham is a perfectly reasonable example in order to not like ruffle the wrong feathers.
I'm just saying, when I think of failed masculinity, I think of something very different.
Same,
But all right.
absolutely same.
But like we're seeing more reductions happen over here. Like we're seeing more attempted burials, and now it's not in the realm of popular discourse. It's not in the realm of like conservatives with a specific ideological agenda. It's in the realms of the academy. It's in the realms of people who say they like this theory, then they value this theory, and they like treat it as serious scholarship. But what do they fucking do? They use it as like, oh, intersectionality means overlaps of any two identities. Bye.
This is reminds me of something also, like, because they perceive this intersectional threat, people that are on the left feel the same kind of, ooh, my position is shaky now that the subaltern have a modicum of social cachet to speak up. What am I? What am
Emma,
I?
we're a feminist podcast. You can use the word men on here.
No, but it's not just about men, to be fair. Like, that's specifically why I didn't say only men. Like, men are exceptionally bad about it, but like, that's not
No,
just about them.
you're correct. I just no, you're absolutely correct. And like unlike a lot of the worst examples of like intersectionality being misused in my face have not been men actually, because I rarely talk to men.
Right, but they perceive it as this thing, so they kind of try to. And this is gonna come up in a different episode we recorded this, which is much worse than this one because the scholarship in it is significantly worse. But they build up because they perceive intersectionality as a threat, and then they understand it as like this Jenga stacking, right? So they try to give themselves more Jenga pieces, right? To build up this armor of moral defensibility, this armor of epistemic authority that will allow them to speak over the fucking faggots. And so they this is sort of like this stupid David Beckham article because it's basically creating an additional like piece for the intersectionality armor they're building for themselves. Like, so David Beckham is simply too faggish to be quite considered a man, and like people will carve out these pieces for themselves too. Like, a heterosexual couple that likes BDSM. I guess they're kind of queer.
The entire category of metrosexuality,
Mm,
Oh my god.
that's a vintage. That's a vintage.
right? Like that whole time, it was just like, wait a minute, so these guys are somehow of a different sex because they use moisturizer regularly?
I fucking wish it was that easy to change sex. Yeah, if I could use moisturizer and take more frequent showers to trans my sex, trust me.
Don't think any of us old ones didn't hide in plain sight in that shit though, y'all.
I mean. But like this is the thing that we're getting at. The conservative framing, the conservative idea of what intersectionality is, it has been ultimately unchallenged because even progressives and liberals, even leftists do this with feminist theories a lot. And like let's be totally clear, the reduction of like first of all the reduction of intersectionality to a legal theory really discounts the fact that even in the original paper, Crenshaw herself, yes, she was speaking in the language of legal theory, but she was also talking about stories, narratives, and she was applying the legal theory to the social conditions of her time, to activism, to the simple fact, the simple state of existing as a black woman. It was like exposing this reality in an undeniable way through the language of legal theory. But intersectionality has always been a social theory, and it has always been a feminist theory.
And it's always been an extremely approachable theory. I like there is a reason that, and Crenshaw tracks it later in other writings, there is a reason that she keeps going to those stories, and there is a reason why those stories have power. Because those stories are built on our own common sense knowledge of the world around us, and you can't read the judge's rulings through those stories and experience anything but a total and complete disconnect, a total
Yeah.
a total inability to understand how law even operates in that moment because you're being gaslit. Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons why why intersectionality ends up bleeding out into other feminist theories, other theories of marginalization, honestly, at the same rate that Marx did in the 70s, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh my God, we have this whole new understanding of this thing called oppression. It makes perfect sense. I'm thinking of Iris Marion Young, of course, Catherine McKinnon, and it's not shade at all, but it's interesting how those forms of feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism, white feminism, were so quickly taken up by the academy, right? And this very simple but very erudite statement of black feminism, much like most of the
Mm-hmm.
other simple but erudite statements on by black feminists, right? Ain't I a Woman by both Bell Hooks and by Sojourner Truth, right? It's the way that the academy has to intellectualize the thing, right? I'm gonna make you hate the academy just a little bit more, right? What I read in both of those masculine studies articles, when I read the lit review of Crenshaw, was white boys checking a box. The
Yeah.
end. It's like, oh, I have to speak. I just pure institutional politics of there is no way I cannot speak to this, and the only way I can speak to it is to point out that white men feel oppression too, and there are intersections of whiteness. Cool, cool, bro. You know, I like King of the Hill too, but I'm not writing papers about the cultural endpoint of regional dialects in adult cartoons.
These are all attempts to contain a fundamentally uncontainable theory because the simple truth of it just shines and speaks out.
Yes.
The legal brilliance in the demarginalizing paper is not about the fact that intersectionality is this groundbreaking legal theory, which I'm to be clear, it still is. But it's the fact that Crenshaw uses her acumen, her skill, her expertise in legal theory to show the massive disconnect between how the law treats the lived social reality of black women and their actual reality.
It is such a brilliant and erudite theory because, right, she is able to bring in all of the things that she is thinking about, all of the people that are asking these questions, which were outside of the law, right, into legal studies. Yes, on its surface, Ben Shapiro is right. This is a piece of legal philosophy, right? It is also, right, one of the very rare times, right, the other one being Priscilla Cornell and a few others, right, where intersections were engaged in, right, eminent critique. That's what they're mad at her about. This is an eminent critique
Yeah.
of the current legal system and the way that race and gender interact in that. And, you know, it's it's borderline impossible to break up autoethnography, oral histories, ethnography, right? Because at the end of the day, right, a subject position is asserted. And this subject position that Crenshaw asserts is one, I mean, it's so destabilizing to the way that law understands itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just to have to stop in American law and say, no, race is a thing. It's a thing that was built by law, and it is a thing that is perpetrated by law. It means that you have to trace those machinations out. American jurists are fucking lazy, bro. They're not doing that, right? They all fancy themselves philosophers, but none of them are actually doing the heavy lifting that's that's required to adjudicate.
No, because the heavy lifting, the the heavy lifting, the philosophizing, the actual thinking about intersectionality, it only comes in the form of how to misappropriate it, instrumentalize it, misinterpret it. You can't erase it, but you can obscure it, right? And that's the thing that frustrates me the most about how successful this like obscurantism has been. And it's like, so I'm about to blow everyone's minds over here. Crenshaw did not stop writing in 1989. She has more papers. She has worked on
No,
things
she did not. She also didn't stop being an activist when she wrote this.
nope, or a feminist. She has written papers on things like looking at the rates of IPV among immigrant women. She has always been exploring, the marginalities, always been trying to forefront the stories of the most vulnerable of us, and usually explicitly the most vulnerable women of us, because usually the most vulnerable of us are women. And there's this incredibly interesting thing where as I followed and I traced more of her writings and more of her scholarship, whether it was actually scholarship or whether it was just interviews or articles, but like more of the things that she said about intersectionality. The Vox article from earlier, it has this really lovely quote that I like trotting out where Crenshaw just straight up says, I hear people talking about intersectionality and I wonder whose intersectionality they're citing, and then they cite me. And it's just so contrary to how I think about intersectionality. That's just not anything I've ever said. Okay?
Yeah, I feel like we have to point out that, like, in the beginning of the episode, I sort of pointed to an example of misuse of intersectionality that's basically white people sorting people of color into their favorite tokens of color. But
Yes.
within feminism discourse, intersectionality is often appealed to basically say that feminism doesn't account for men enough.
Yep.
That is probably the most common invocation.
And I have a citation for this one. Now, this is something that I have experienced, like, just as a woman out in the world, but, like, it would be anecdotal. It would be autoethnography, I guess. However, there's this, like, very interesting scholar who actually observed this phenomenon and decided to write a paper about it around 2010, talking about how intersectionality, despite, against its original intent, is actually deployed even in the academy as a means of like mollifying, or basically intersectionality is deployed against feminist theory to try to downplay feminist theory, to say that like feminism is too essentialist about the contradiction between women and men. And if you just applied intersectionality, then like you would see that like this is not how feminism should be done. The scholar who made that point is called Kimberlé Crenshaw. Like she sees this stuff. She wrote about it. She's like, what the hell are you people doing with my theory?
No, but Talia, don't you understand? Like, isn't it a little bit bioessentialist to say that women exist and are discriminated? Like, we've all agreed that this is wrong, and so if this is wrong, then why are you talking about women's discrimination? Surely we must invent something else.
Now, to be clear, the paper that I'm referring to is a 2010 paper called "Close Encounters of Three Kinds," where Kimberlé Crenshaw talks about um the perception of her theory up to the students, even among students in her own classroom. These are like young people. These are bright people. These are activists. These are students who are incredibly interested in all the intersections of oppression, to the point that they have signed up for her class. They're very engaged and they're very committed. And they all almost uniformly seem to think that Kimberlé Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality is simply incompatible with dominance feminism. Now, a disclaimer I have to put over here is that Crenshaw is specifically talking about her theory of intersectionality, and when set against the dominance feminist paradigm of radical feminist Catherine MacKinnon. There are critiques to be made of Catherine MacKinnon's body of work, to be sure, and we'll get there eventually. But the thing that Crenshaw points out consistently is that none of the critiques that people are making of Catherine MacKinnon's work actually hold any water or make any sense. Intersectionality is being invoked to say that the idea, the statement "men oppress women" is too essentialist. That like it's too gender essentialist to actually take that as the premise of a modern feminism. And Crenshaw just looks at that and goes, "Huh?
the most recent one I have read was basically that, well, men are hurt as men too, so that means that understanding the organization of gender as a hierarchy, the way radical feminism understands it, is clearly wrong. And it's like, well, no. Only if you understand it in like super crayon goo goo gaga terms of like that the whole explanation of the hierarchy ends with men gooder, woman badder. The end. Like if you understand it like that, then sure, that's wrong. but but that's not
And
what it
that's
is.
and yet that's not even the most frustrating way that intersectionality is played. So intersectionality, Crenshaw lays it out in the paper. Intersectionality is now primarily seen as an anti-racist theory and not so much as a feminist theory. Therefore, the way it ends up being invoked is to say, well, you can't make these statements about feminism because, to say that like women all have this in common when there are so many contradictions amongst women, on the basis of race or sexuality or ability.
This
You
reminds me of
can't just
something.
talk.
This reminds me of a certain legal argument
Uh huh. Uh
that
huh. Uh
someone might
huh.
have cited.
You can't actually talk about all women as a singular class, because that's essentialist, because there's too many internal contradictions within them. you know? Mm. And it's amazing. Meanwhile, intersectionality is a perfectly fine anti-racist theory because making generalized statements about all people as like a singular race who are affected by like the forces of racialization in similar ways, that's fine. That's not essentialist, there are no contradictions between people of a single race, of course. This is why I had a great time in India growing up.
Yes, so as a white cis woman, I am listening and learning. All people of the same race are the same, but none of the women are all women. I am listening and learning.
Yeah, see, because there's just something innately different about women of color. Like women of color are really not even the same gender as well. Crenshaw goes into this. Like, if you are familiar at this point with her style of argumentation, with her style of writing, with her style of arguing, you can see the exact same the exact same rhetorical style in demarginalizing and in her defense of her original point in demarginalizing of intersectionality as a theory. Only I think that like after 20 years of this bullshit, I think that somehow she's even snarkier. Like she's only gotten snarkier with age and time.
Well, I mean, wouldn't you get snarkier in this situation?
Transrat Femme came out a month ago. I do not know how it's going to be misused and misinterpreted over the course of my lifetime, and I'm not looking
You don't
forward
get to
to
make
it.
those decisions.
Nope,
Like,
it's out of my
look,
hands
like
now.
there's literally two kinds of philosophers in the canon, right? There are philosophers that write something brilliant very early on in their careers, right? And spend their entire career defending that. There are philosophers that write something brilliant and keep right on writing and exploring the world, like Crenshaw has, right? And like, I think the other one is like, I think Crenshaw's like path of, I'm just going to keep doing research and I'm going to keep like, pulling these examples and stuff like that is really the best answer to that, right? Because she's still doing the work. She's still engaging the world with the curiosity that we expect of a scholar, right? But she's also taking time to go back every once in a while, right? And clap back because, like, I mean, I don't know if anybody has watched any of the Senate or watched any of the Senate hearings or House hearings on
Mm-hmm.
DEI, right?
Oh my god.
But it was
Yeah.
patently insane. It was
Yeah.
patently insane, right? And the reason it's patently insane is because it's sort of two different epistemological worldviews, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
white male dominated worldviews are worldviews built on hierarchies, right? There has to be a hierarchy of some kind. This goes all the way back to the Great Chain of Being in the Middle Ages, right? Whereas, like theorists like Crenshaw, especially us legal theorists, we tend to present less hierarchies and more like drop down menus, right?
Yeah.
And one of the most fundamental misunderstandings of her work is that is exactly what she's doing here. She's like, oh, well, I'm claiming multiple overlapping oppression. There's your little like highlight bar, right?
Yeah.
What is going on there? Oh, look, here are multiple, like different forms of oppression. Like the oppression of the legal oppression of women and the legal oppression of black people are completely different. The legal, like the jurisprudence around African Americans and natives, native peoples, right? Dramatically different, right? Like that's
Yeah.
literally all she's doing here is going, look, all of these things exist. We know they all exist. This is what they look like. This is how they operate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And this is the sort of like menu of things that tend to fall under, right? Fall under like the category of multiple overlapping oppressions. And it just so happens that that's what intersectionality takes as its jumping off point, right? Is the fact that these things inevitably overlap. Other critical race theorists after, like specifically legal theorists after Crenshaw, right? Laura Gomez, for example, she begins talking about it as, she begins talking about race and law as being concomitant of each other, right? That and cites again, Crenshaw and intersectionality, but like her where she takes this question of right, like overlapping oppressions is right that at a certain point when we go all the way back and all the way back and all the way back, we can no longer tell the difference between law making race and race making law. And they can't operate without each other. If you think about like the legal world of antebellum America, right, with half of the continent having an entire like segment of the population enslaved and having laws in every branch of law that dealt with that enslavement, right, from like criminal law all the way through family law and inheritance law, right, versus the other half of the nation which had none of these. No laws were on the books about like these sort of things, right? Very few criminal statutes existed, right? Like those were things
Yeah.
that would come later and they developed later because like Southern law had to push into, right, like Northern understandings about, um, or Southern law finally connected with like Northern understandings about race that made sense. And it got really simple. Well, you're not suggesting that we free all of these black people living in our white nation. Like, how is that going to work? They're going to kill us all. And the Northerners picked up on that too. They were like, you know what? You are absolutely right. These people are our natural enemy. We need to start figuring out ways to get them out of the United States. But like in the white consciousness, that separation was such that they could not occupy the same social space without conflict, right?
Hmm.
And Crenshaw just kind of steps in and is like, yeah, and this is what that looks like. And this is what it looks like when, women come into conflict with the law because it operates in similar manners, but different circumstances, right? Like,
The disempowerment of women in like legal systems is like one of those things that like we just don't talk about anymore, because like here's what Crenshaw is really doing, right? She is exposing that like as totalizing a force as race is in America, and like I'm glad you spoke on that, Kay, because that's not something I can speak on, because like ultimately as someone from India, as someone like who is like more an immigrant to a Western context, I don't have that settler colonial experience of race as this absolute totalizing force. But then Crenshaw comes in and says that, like, as totalizing a force as race is, ultimately, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the US regime, who's like for whom race is this like fundamental axiom, of how institutions even function. Even in that case, womanhood matters. Womanhood modifies your
Yeah.
relationship to these institutions, to how you
Yes.
move about in the world. And this is something that needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be unburied. Look, when I saw that paper by Kimberlé Crenshaw, and she talked about how mystified that she was that the majority of her students are always shocked when she like defends dominance feminism, when she like cites intersectionality's compatibility with radical feminism. Her students are shocked. I wasn't shocked, okay? I wasn't shocked. I have been told time and again over the course of my feminist career that intersectionality and radical feminism don't go hand in hand. That radical feminism has been disproved by intersectionality. And let me be clear that there are a lot of flaws with radical feminism, and I have talked about them at length in writing. But like the idea that it is like incompatible with like just the very idea of race or racialization has never really twigged. And but I decided even then I decided to take my interlocutors at their word. So when I sat down and thought to myself, I'm going to write the next book, it's going to be brown trans les, I'm going to talk a lot more about colonialism and race and all these processes that interact with gendering in these complicated ways. I decided that I was going to explore the space of whether we can talk about intersectionality in a radical feminist or a materialist feminist way. I set out to see if I could synthesize radical feminism and intersectionality, and what I discovered is that I don't fucking have to, because it was done
No,
for me.
you don't. This is my thing with like you get this a lot with like women of color, like the women of color feminism. I guess school at this point, like Moraga and Ansel Dua, right? And even like the Combahee River Collective
River Collective,
and
yeah.
Black lesbian feminism, right?
Mm-hmm.
They all across the board
Mm-hmm.
refer to themselves as radical feminists. And what all of them across the board
Yeah.
set out to prove was that, as a matter of fact, Black femininity can't be erased from the idea of womanhood. Neither can Latinx femininity or Asian femininity or any of these other like cultural understandings of femininity and womanhood. You can't base that category on just the Anglo-European experience because it's
Exactly.
true, but it's disingenuous. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, look, like there is a categorical sort of difference between men and women when it comes mostly when it comes to like reproduction and the sort of power differentials that have been ascribed to reproductive roles.
Yeah,
Um, right?
or rather the social substrate that has like sprung up around the enforcement of reproductive roles.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, God, I think it's Nancy Fraser, who writes this really, really amazing pithy article about like about like the sort of history of like masculinization, right? And one of the things that she begins to point out almost immediately, right, is that as, societies became more male dominated, right, their value for difference, for alterity, for other forms of being in the world, like just
Mm-hmm.
drops like almost exponentially, right? And I think that's something, you know, for me, like also where I would like to end on is that like one of the things I got to see, or I took part in a seminar that Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum did. And yes, I fangirled the whole time I like that she lectured. I just sat in the back and fanned myself and I was like, damn, that woman's brilliant. So Kimberly, if you're listening to this, that's what I did the entire time. The most, the thing that struck me the most by what she said was in the entirety of this weekend long seminar was, we are to the point now where we are even going to have to begin critiquing, understanding, and redeveloping our religious understandings in order to break down this sort of white male subject position that does, flatly does not see anything about the real world whatsoever. For me, is like Crenshaw's final argument is that the problem with the problem with these things as they stand is that they are so divorced from the real world and so academic that they can't even see plain reality. Like, and
That's it.
I agree. Like,
That's
I think
exactly
that
it.
that is a criticism. First of all, I want to say that is a specifically black feminist, specifically woman of color feminism, like trope of rather than playing to this category, I am going to ground my theory in the actual lived experiences of women. Like in women of color
Yes.
feminism, we call it the theory of the flesh, right? Moraga and Ansel Dua were very clear in the 1979 introduction to this bridge called My Back that what was more important about understanding womanhood was actual women's stories, working women's stories,
Yes.
like what they endured as sex workers, as women in the workplace, as all of these. Like that was the new frontier of sexism.
Yeah, as racialized women, as sexualized women, as like women who like have no choice but to participate in the heterosexual economy, and as women who tried to resist. Like okay, here's the thing. Yes, yes, yes. There's a multiplicity. Okay, that there is a multiplicity of experiences among womanhood. I'm a trans woman. Okay, I know that there are many different specific experiences. But here's the thing.
There
Okay,
are different experiences amongst us. Like,
yeah, folks, look, I am a trans woman, and what that means is that I do not take kindly to attempts to erase womanhood. Okay? I doubt Kimberlé Crenshaw is ever going to listen to this, okay? But I will say, on her behalf, stop doing that shit, okay? Here's
yes.
the least surprising thing, or like, or rather, the reason it was so unsurprising for me to like crack open a paper and see an impassioned defense of like radical feminism's, you know, dominance feminism theory from Kimberlé Crenshaw herself was because underneath all the brilliance, underneath all the amazing rhetoric and the true syncretic genius that is the demarginalizing paper. Underneath all of that, you know what there is? There's a primal fucking scream. And I recognize that. I
Mm,
recognize
mm.
the scream of a woman who can see these things, who can intuitively, see these things being done to her and needs all of you, everyone else, to see the world in the way she does, so you can even begin to approach her understanding and begin to unpack all of this so that you can join her where she's at. I recognize that scream. That's intersectionality.
I see intersectionality a lot as being called basically upon women of color to like side with their men, right? Talia,
Yes.
don't talk about
Our
feminism. Don't you
men.
know that Indian men suffer, go back to being their property. And
Black
every time
men.
this happens, I'm like reminded of we have a version of this thing too of like, feminism is for these lily-livered Western people that are degenerate and they don't really understand. They're not built of the tough stuff like we are. Like this whole thing is not for us, and like this is really about your husband looking at you. You see all those like mannish, dykish feminists in the West. You're not going to be like that, are you?
Oh.
Like, who do you think you are? And so every time I see like a woman of color being called like that, I can just see it plainly like written. That's what she's being really asked is like, who do you think you are? Some kind of white
Mm.
woman? Shut up.
It's a reassertion of the property relation. It's like you are our woman to treat as you please. And yeah, don't go around getting all these highfalutin ideas that you deserve parity with your men.
Like, we don't even deserve parity with them at the level of suffering.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to talk shit about, like, black men being targeted by the police or any of that. That is all 100% true. As Kimberly Crenshaw has pointed out, though, it is also 100% true that black women, women of color, still make up the preponderance of police violence. And that's not discussing, right, like police rape or things like that. She, her position literally showing that, like, we are killed at an exponentially greater rate by police than even black men
Yeah.
because we're we're the disposable one of the race. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
they need the black body, they need the black male body to run the fucking economy. But like black women, you know, or BIPOC women of all stripes, right? Like we're kind of superfluous to the whole system, right? Because white women are superfluous to capitalism, right? We're doubly and triply superfluous.
Yep, because we can't provide the kind of reproductive labor that, like, the hegemony, the natalist regime of the hegemony values and desires. Like, this is very familiar to
We
me as a
can't
trans
produce the
woman,
right
but like,
citizen.
yep,
Mm,
exactly. And this is very familiar to me as a trans woman, but like, this is the point of commonality. This is the point where women of color and trans women, of color or not, are degendered on very similar grounds. And that's the main thing, okay? The more you think about these things, the more you think about intersectionality, the more you think about feminism, the more you think about a feminist ethos that is fundamentally centered on the stories and struggles of women, we find a lot of commonalities, you know? There aren't
mm,
as many essential differences between women as I think the men of the world, whether our men or not, would like to believe.
no, absolutely, right? And it's also femininity is also not as mysterious as the Western canon leads us to believe. It's actually a pretty straightforward way of looking at the world, and I think that this argument show like claps back to the understandings of feminism that you were highlighting, Emma, right? That like we're all just a bunch of like hairy dykes. Well, I am a hairy dyke, but that doesn't have anything to do with me being a
Oh yeah,
feminist. Like, hey, it doesn't.
yeah. I'm just Harry
Um,
Deck because that's a hot thing to be.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I hate shaving, and I'm brown, so all of my hair is like really dark. It takes a lot of makeup to cover this shit up. A lot.
I fucking suck at makeup. But okay. Anyway, as you can see, look. That's the thing that I really want to like, and that's the thing I really want to point out as we wrap this up. Okay, like we are on this podcast right now. We are three women of incredibly different experiences. But don't you fucking dare tell a single one of us that we can't relate to each other's struggles.
Oh yeah.
Right, we all suck at makeup.
Yeah, and we all fucking suck at makeup. Oh, this has been Cracked Ivory, where we've talked about the brilliant Kimberlé Crenshaw and her legal theory, her social feminist theory of intersectionality, and about how much we all fucking suck at makeup.
Before we go, okay, uh, if you are anywhere on social media or anything like that, feel free to plug yourself or anything you want to draw attention to, like your work or someone else's work. Feel free to do that before we sign off.
Oh, thank you. I mean, first, I would also like to give a big shout out to May Peterson, uh, as
Yes, we love
like
May.
She is a darling.
also someone who, like I have had some extremely, extremely, extremely intense conversations with, and like, doesn't she have a new novel coming out like extremely soon?
Yeah,
I believe it's not like extremely soon. She's last we talked to her, she said she's not sure exactly when it comes out because publishing, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, point is she's got one on the horizon and it's going to be amazing. I think that's it.
amazing. Support May Peterson's work, everyone.
Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes, as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind the scenes content. Follow Talia at taliabot.com and Emma Zaharuk at dolphindiaries.cart.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zakharouk and produced by Talia and Emma Zakharouk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. Thanks for listening.